to welcome all of you to this particular plenary on envisioning the study of religion in the 21st century. In this plenary, the panelists will offer their reflections on how the field of religious studies has changed during their career, some of the issues the field needs to address, the turns and twists in their own scholarship, the challenges and the changing roles of the American Academy of Religion, and the visions and constraints for change in the study of religion in the United States and in Europe. We have three very distinguished panelists, Professor Laurel Donaldson, Professor Richard King, and Professor Donald Lopez, Jr. First, we will have Professor Laurel Donaldson, who is a professor of English, Religious Studies, and American Indian Studies at Cornell University. She received her doctorate from Emory University in 1983. She has served on the National Executive Board on Committee on Women, Population, and the Environment, and as a faculty fellow of Cornell's particular house that tends to the needs of Native American students and their culture. She is the author of Decolonizing Feminisms, Race, Gender, and Empire Building, which presented new interpretative paradigms on colonialism and the question of feminist reading. She is also the editor of Postcolonialism and Scriptural Reading, a special issue of Semir, a journal of experimental biblical criticism. She is also the co-editor with me on this volume, Postcolonialism, Feminism, and Religious Discourse. She's working on a new book titled American Samson, Haunting the Native Christian Encounter. Please welcome Professor Donaldson.
Good afternoon. Our task for this plenary today is to predict the future of religious studies in 15 minutes or less. But I've always been a better historian than a prophet. So instead of predicting the future, I instead want to raise some concerns that I feel are crucial for the development of religious studies as we move into the 21st century. Last night, our president said in her address that she went to Occupy Boston to see if she could find some sources of hope for the possibility of a just world. What I will be talking about this morning may not constitute an overt source of hope, but at the very least, I believe that it contains potential resources for creating socio-political alternatives to the ravages of neo-colonialism and predatory globalization. If I had to sum up the motivating force underlying my work as a scholar, I would say that I have tried to define people as actors in the midst of catastrophic disruptions of their cultures, and most of my work is focused on American Indians. I have called this by different names: retraditionalization, negotiation, entanglement, ghost singing. Each of these frameworks focuses on how people suffering from cultural deracination still engage in meaning-making, however marginalized or invisible this might be to the dominant culture. In her provocative book, Things Fall Away, Philippine Historical Experience and the Makings of Globalization, Nefertiti Tadiar asked this question somewhat differently. Quote, faced with the signs of vanishing everywhere that point to the seemingly inexorable vortex of destruction and disappearance that characterizes our global history, how are we to continue the struggle for freedom against the new fate of these millennial capitalist times? For Tadiar, a good part of the answer lies in things such as experiential practices that have fallen away from recognized forms of historical subjectivity and social experience, but nevertheless have become catalysts for everyday life struggles. And of course, Things Fall Away is a play on Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Learning to recognize and attend to these practices is important for all of us, but especially, I think, for religious studies, which is an enterprise at least theoretically concerned with justice. And I want to spend the rest of my time this morning elaborating why. And what I'm going to offer are two examples. They're pretty widely diverse, but I think that's the nature of the discourse that I'm trying to produce here. From 2006 to 2009, a group of social anthropologists from the United Kingdom conducted a research project entitled In the Footsteps of Jesus and the Prophet: Sociality, Caring, and the Religious Imagination in the Filipina Diaspora. This project ultimately expanded beyond the Filipina to cover many aspects of international migration, gender, and the religious imagination. It included data from Christian Filipinas in New Zealand, Muslim Filipinas in Saudi Arabia, Buddhist Sri Lankan women in Jordan, and Indonesian women in Hong Kong, among others. The principal investigators noted in their introduction to the project's ethnographies that dominant scholarly narratives usually represent these female overseas contract workers and domestic helpers as hyper-exploited victims whose only capacity for action is to comply with their own victimization. And indeed, it would be hard to underestimate the hardships and often brutality to which these women are subjected. But there is another side to this story, one that falls away from the dominant narrative of hyper-exploitation. In the Footsteps of Jesus and the Prophet documents the way that migrant women also, quote, creatively engage with the places and landscapes in which they live and labor. And the phenomenon of Nepalese and South Indian domestic workers in Kuwait converting to Islam provides a case in point. Atya Ahmad notes that social anthropologists have tended to regard the conversions of migrant women in Kuwait as embodying women's subordination in context of extreme inequality and domination, whereas other migrants and foreign residents thought that the women were converting just because they would be treated or paid better. However, the domestic helpers themselves told very different stories. Ahmad suggests that they experienced their conversions to Islam as a reworking of, rather than a radical break with their previous practices and relationships. Quote, the focus was on the households in Kuwait where they lived and worked, spaces where they became attuned to and began to adopt Islam, as well as their households in their countries of origin, spaces in which their roles and relationships were being reshaped through their newfound religious beliefs and practices. Many describe this process as a gradual one. Far from an abrupt rejection or transformation of their previous religious traditions and lives, these women experience becoming Muslim as processual, characterized by a gradual re-engagement and reworking of their lives through Islam, a process in which differences between Islam and their previous religious traditions were not necessarily clear, unquote. The story of Sarah, a southern Indian woman who became a domestic helper in Kuwait, offers an excellent example. When the grandmother of the particular household in which she worked became ill, she asked Sarah to provide her daily care. Sarah told Ahmad that what she remembered most vividly about this period was waking up in the early morning, going to the grandmother's room, turning on a cassette recording of Quranic recitations, and then listening to them together with her patient. When the grandmother finally died, Sarah continued listening to these recitations and gradually began supplementing them with Hindi translations of the Quran, as well as other Islamic readings. There was no dramatic conversion to Islam. Rather, Sarah's new forms of piety and interest were marked by the quotidian experiences of her new Kuwaiti life. As Ahmad notes, domestic workers like Sarah emphasized the household as a site of ongoing activity, interaction, and work. And it was through the household that they often unexpectedly learned about and began practicing Islam. I want to extend this analysis by describing Sarah as engaging in a production of experiential labor, which I call a religious imaginary. And this is another link with our president's talk last night. Her turn to Islam through a fluid religious imaginary is neither hegemonic, that is signifying complete subordination, nor counter-hegemonic, that is signifying freedom. And these are the two poles that one usually hears in these analyses. Rather, it emerges from the midst of her hardships and difficulties as a domestic worker. Sarah's religious imaginary is a social practice that enables her to achieve some degree of agency within her subordinated context, a fact that is often elided by dominant representations of migrant women from underdeveloped countries. And I hope this will become clearer after I talk a little more about what this term imaginary actually means. The term religious imaginary is my gloss on the recent conceptual turn to the social imaginary to explain the existence of multiple modernities and account for the distinct characteristics of globalization. Dilip Gankar notes that through the filter of a social imaginary, humans see themselves as agents negotiating a social space and inhabiting a temporal horizon, entertaining certain beliefs and norms, engaging and making sense of practices in terms of purpose and appropriateness, and existing among other agents. Extrapolating for this, the filter of a religious imaginary enables humans to see themselves as agents negotiating a spiritual space, inhabiting a temporal and sometimes even eternal horizon, entertaining certain theological beliefs and moral norms, engaging in and making sense of religious practices in terms of their purpose appropriateness, and existing among those linked to a particular religious tradition. Just as social imaginaries occupy a fluid middle between embodied practices and explicit doctrines, religious imaginaries dwell in the synapse between theology and practical spiritual behaviors. Gankar reminds us that social imaginaries cannot be reducible to theory because they are embedded in the habitus of an individual or people, and they're expressed in modes of address, stories, legends, symbols. I would say that religious imaginaries are found in stories of a people's relationship to the sacred and the stories they tell about other people's relationship to the sacred, the songs they sing to celebrate this, their ritual practices, the symbols of their faith, and their sense of themselves as a spiritual community. And this is certainly not an exhaustive list. Sarah's religious imaginary allowed her to create a new source of strength and self-validation in her work as a domestic helper, as well as in a life far from her country and family. As Tadiar argues, seemingly obsolescent modes of experience produce and shape the very productions of life around which organized politics revolve, because they are the interventions of the people struggling with these conditions. She suggests that putting these modes into language can make available the inventive political potential and alternate social resources carried within these experiences. Potentials and resources that are quickly jettisoned in an attempt to wrest control of a world gone awry. There is no question about overseas contract workers and domestic helpers wresting control of their worlds, which have often gone very much awry. However, like Sarah, they can make significant interventions in these contexts through the experiential labor of religious and social imaginaries. If Tadiar discerns, quote, the political seeds of an alternative future, unquote, in such undervalued experiences, then Sarah's intimate negotiations among religions, cultures, and households offers some clues about how these seeds might flourish. In the larger project for which this talk is basically an introduction, I also look for clues in the subjugated imaginaries of American Indian women. And I just want to mention one example from a Navajo poet, Lucy Tapahanzo. In the realm of the theological, one could say that Christology begins at birth. This is a poem called For Lori, I Want to Say Thank You to You This Christmas. And it's her rewriting of the Nativity story. The Gospel of Matthew answers questions about Jesus by beginning with a genealogy legitimizing his Hebrew and royal lineage. Because of their usefulness in staking claims to social status and particular offices, genealogies have historically constituted an important element of biblical Christologies. And even the Gospel of Luke, whose favorable attitudes toward women have led some feminists to call it the most dangerous book in the Bible, nevertheless constructs Jesus' messianic genealogy in terms of his sonship. And this is where Lucy Tapahanzo's imaginary, poetic imaginary, makes a crucial intervention. And I want to read Luke 2:8. In that region there were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flocks by night. Preachers, scholars, and ordinary Christians have emphasized the shepherds as unusual eyewitnesses to Jesus' birth. After all, they were poor, uneducated, and from the most marginalized strata of ancient Mediterranean society. Most interpreters also assume they were men. If one were a Navajo, however, the Lucan shepherds in question would most likely be women. Historically, it was Diné women who owned the family domicile, including the buildings, the gardens, as well as the flocks of sheep. The Navajo were first introduced to sheep when they encountered animals who had strayed from the flocks brought from Europe by the Spanish conquistadors. The consequences of keeping sheep could be quite severe and punishable with imprisonment or even death. After releasing the Navajo from their internment at Bosque Redondo, however, that was 1864 to 1868, the U.S. government actively encouraged sheep herding as a strategy of pacification and issued approximately 34,000 sheep and goats to Navajos throughout the Southwest. This project became so successful that both the human and sheep population of the Navajo Nation increased between 3- and 4-fold in the span of only 60 years. However, this very success carried the seeds of tragedy in the form of a drastic stock reduction program undertaken in 1934. As a solution to the alleged problem of overgrazing and its consequent degradation of the environment, the Bureau of Indian Affairs confiscated and slaughtered the people's beloved sheep. And one reason I'm giving this context of sheep is that sheep become important characters in the poem. And you can also go into some canyons on the Navajo reservation and see thousands of skeletons of Navajo Churro sheep that were slaughtered during the stock reduction. The bond of the Navajo with their sheep is similar to the relation of many native cultures with animals. Rather than resources to be harvested or grazing units in need of elimination, animals instead exist as other than human persons. The English language is misleading in this regard because most native tongues have no separate generic term for animal and use only specific names for each species. The absence of a separate semantic category for animals indicates that many Indian cultures make no sharp distinction between animals and humans and regard both as key participants in the creative processes of life. For Native North American, animals enter into covenants with their human counterparts and in many stories actually help to create the human world. Animals also provide humans with crucial knowledge, the knowledge necessary for survival, and frequently become mentors in humanity's learning stages. This view does not restrict the powers and values available in the world to the realm of the human, but rather distributes them among many forms of life. The reality of distributed power most certainly informs the poetic imaginary of Lucy Tapahanzo, since it is the sheep, rather than angels, who announce the good news of Jesus' birth and signal the identifying characteristics of the Jesus figure's originary event. And I just want to read part of the poem here. You told the story at 7 to your little brothers and sisters. Baby Jesus, Awichi, born somewhere on the other side of the world, far, far away. Some sheep, cows, and horses saw him, and they told other sheep, cows, and horses. And so they know too. All of them know, and all of us know, this, my daughter, is Christmas. This stanza from Tapahanzo's poem represents a significant departure from Luke's narrative, which, contrary to its representations in popular culture, does not mention the presence of animals in the manger where Mary laid Jesus. For Tapahanzo, however, they become important witnesses to Christ's birth. Even more importantly, humans only learn about this special event through knowledge communicated by the animals. Although the poem portrays animals as distinct from humans, all of them and all of us know, it also endows them with intentionality in understanding the significance of the birth of Jesus, a significant evidence in their decision to communicate the event to others, with subjectivity and agency in their taking on the role of storytellers, and with personhood in their depiction as knowing subjects analogous to knowing humans. Tapahanzo's nativities, both her native perspective and the Christian nativities she poetically reimagines, encourage her readers to affirm a transformative interrelationship and intersubjectivity among all forms of life. Her account of Jesus' birth lays him in a cradle woven with a dense web of relationships between human persons and other than human persons. a religious imaginary of Jesus' origin that disrupts the Christian patriarchal genealogy of his sonship. I've just been told I have 1 minute, so I'm going to jump to the ending, and I want to end actually with another story. Perhaps the most fitting way to end this talk would be to conclude with another religious imaginary, one in which Jesus is a Yaqui Indian. According to Yaqui Euro-American poet and artist Anita Endreze, he, Jesus, walked from rancheria to rancheria in the 4 directions. He wore sandals made out of plant fibers and a straw hat. He crossed the rivers, walking up to his knees in water, and traveled through deserts of thorn bushes and snakes. He was a curer and possessed sciatica, a flower body that is one full of spirit power. It is a gift given in the womb. Thank you.
Our second panelist is Professor Richard King, who studied philosophy and theology at Howe University before completing his doctorate in religious studies at Lancaster University in 1993. He joined the University of Glasgow last year after 5 years as Professor of Religious Studies at Vanderbilt University. Professor King is a historian of ideas by orientation, with a concern to explore genealogical questions of power and representations in the study of Asian traditions. His work seeks to examine ways in which South Asian wisdom traditions have become globally represented since the late colonial era by the world religions template, and the role played in this by the emergence of the comparative study of religion as an academic enterprise in the West. His many books include Orientalism and Religion, Postcolonial Theory, India, and the Mythic East, Selling Spirituality, and Religion and Violence in South Asia. Please welcome Professor King.
Thank you, Pui-Lan, for inviting me to be on this august panel. The post-colonial, I would suggest, which is what I want to focus my points on, looks at the archive, looks at colonial history. It, in my view, should also be a comment upon the present, but also is about imagination. It's about imagining alternate futures. So today I'd like to make some brief comments about issues confronting the future of the comparative study of religion, with a particular eye to that post-colonial turn, to the way we write histories of religious studies as a field, and very briefly to economic and ideological challenges to the study of religion in the early 21st century. Debates within the field of religious studies, particularly in the last 20 years, have increasingly focused on the hidden, one might even say dark side of the field, that is the cultural, political, and social processes that brought this particular academic subject into existence, and the politics of its ongoing transformation. This interest in the way in which the field has been constructed is most strikingly exemplified, for me, by scholarship that has sought to denaturalize the concept of religion itself as a category that can be mapped seamlessly onto the diverse social and cultural fabrics of the world. A plethora of new critical perspectives have emerged from those labeled by the slightly problematic and occasionally triumphalist prefix post, postmodernism, postcolonialism, poststructuralism, to other related critical trends such as queer theory, critical race theory, etc. The field, or the practice, of the comparative study of religion is currently going through a process of engaging with these various intellectual trends, to which there are, and no doubt will continue to be, a variety of responses. This has led to a widespread suspicion of grand narratives, of the universalist claims of an older generation of scholars to be able to speak in broadly essentialist terms about something called religion. This anxiety about generating cross-cultural claims has cast doubt on the very possibility of a comparative study of religion, certainly from a post-colonial perspective. I want to suggest that such concerns are crucial to our work, but that they do not create an impasse that prevents the possibility of a self-critical and nuanced comparativism to take place. The challenge to established categories and paradigms within the study of religion, however, is not just an internal product of the cultural or social constructivist turn in Western theoretical debates. It is also, I wish to argue, a gradually unfolding cultural effect, an aftershock, if you will, of the dissolution of European colonialism and the ideologies and paradigms that supported it. In an interview with a Zen Roshi during a visit to Japan in 1978, French historian of ideas Michel Foucault was asked if he thought that Eastern thought might provide a way out of the contemporary crisis of Western thought. Interesting question in itself, the way it's framed. Foucault's reply is interesting, particularly since it opens up avenues of exploration that he himself did not follow. This is what he said, and I quote, "It is true, European thought finds itself at a turning point. This turning point on an historical scale is nothing other than the end of imperialism. The crisis of Western thought is identical to the end of imperialism. The crisis has produced no supreme philosopher who excels in signifying this crisis, for it is the end of the era of Western philosophy. Thus, if philosophy of the future exists, it must be born outside of Europe, or equally born in consequence of meetings and impacts between Europe and non-Europe." Foucault's knowledge of Asian philosophy was rather limited, as his discussion of Zen Buddhism in this 1978 interview quickly demonstrates. However, what Foucault does here is explicitly link the dominance of Western modes of thought to the might of European imperial power. A key factor in being able to make the claim that Western thinkers and theories constitute theory in toto has been the sheer military, political, and cultural dominance of the West in the last few centuries of world history. The last 300 years of European colonialism has enabled a whole network of European categories, ideas, and paradigms to appear more universal and normative than they might otherwise have seemed. The local history and categories of one particular part of the world projected onto the others in the quest for a universal history has tended, as Dipesh Chakrabarty has suggested, to place Europe and European civilization at its center. Since the Second World War, we've been living through a period of history that Cornell West has called the passing of the age of Europe. But it now seems that it is not just Europe, but the Western world more generally that is losing its position of hegemony, and surprisingly rapidly. Indeed, for macro historians like André Gunder Frank, the economic and political dominance of the Western world in recent centuries is more accurately seen as a short phase within a larger historical trend of an Asian-centered world. This is important since, as the age of European imperialism has faded, so increasingly has the belief that European worldviews and epistemologies constitute a normative and therefore universal way of understanding the world and our human experience of it. In other words, in a world more conscious than ever before of the multicultural and post-colonial demands upon Occidental claims to universal truth, the provinciality of Euro-American ways of understanding the world is being highlighted with reference to their historical specificity and provenance. Although the age of European colonialism is over, for the second half of the 20th century, the task of preserving Western global supremacy has been maintained by the social, political, economic, and military might of the United States of America and its Atlantic alliance with the former colonial powers of Europe. This has been mostly achieved not primarily through military power, but through new forms of virtual colonialism that do not necessitate direct political rule, but operate instead through the global spread of capitalism and the increasing power of transnational corporations to affect, even transform, local societies and economies. Some theorists, such as Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, argue that this represents a new form of stateless sovereignty, dominated by the free transfer of capital across borders. The deterritorialized and decentralized nature of this empire, they suggest, make it all but impossible to locate within or be controlled by specific nation states. A situation we are currently seeing being played out in the Eurozone and in the current US debt crisis. So far, nation states have proven incapable of controlling the flow of capital across their borders, with potentially devastating consequences for their economies and their populations, especially the 99%. It is not yet clear if this is a dire but medium to short-term financial crisis, or if we are actually seeing an acceleration of a more fundamental reconfiguring of global governance. Franck Biancheri, one of the few social scientists to accurately predict the 2008 financial crisis, has suggested that the story that has been unfolding since 1989 is not the triumph of Western democracy and capitalism over communism, but rather the gradual and now rapidly accelerating collapse of the post-World War II world order that maintained, if significantly transformed, the colonial domination of the West. This collapse, he argues, is symbolized by the collapse of two walls: the Berlin Wall in 1989, and now the demise of Wall Street and the global financial system of which it is a prime mover and beneficiary. The rise of China and India in particular is likely to lead to a considerable increase in the socio-economic, political, and cultural influence of Asia in the 21st century. This is something that academic institutions in the Western world and organizations like the AAR will need to be prepared for in terms of the increasing demand for analysis, expertise, and a means of responding to such global shifts. A growing realization of increased competition from Asian universities in international ranking tables and graduate studies programs, and more generally in terms of changing patterns in the transnational flow of ideas, skills, and people. In the context of crashing financial markets, perhaps the biggest challenge to the study of religion at this moment in our history is simultaneously economic and ideological. To give an example, in the context of the crisis in financial markets and the bailing out of banks by taxpayers across the world, the UK state, like the US one, is, to all intents and purposes, bankrupt. Many of you will have seen Florida Governor Rick Scott's threat to withdraw funding for subjects such as anthropology in favor of subjects that have, in his view, good job prospects. This policy is essentially the one about to be implemented in England, where there has been a complete withdrawal of state funding from all but the so-called STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and math, and a virtually instantaneous switch to a consumer fee-paying system based on a quadrupling of student fees to cover for the rolling back of state funding. In this context, the arts, humanities, and social sciences have been effectively abandoned by the state to market forces overnight, whilst at the same time UK universities remain unable to determine their own student intake numbers because this and a cap on tuition fees remains controlled by the government. At the moment, this means the higher education system in England, it's slightly different in Scotland, reflects the worst of two possible worlds: radically underfunded by the state and subject to the ravages of short-term market demand, and yet constrained by government in terms of the possibilities of expansion and fee levy. The biggest problem, however, remains an ideological one, in my view, namely the inability of many, including the current UK government, to see what the point of a university education might be beyond its immediate financial and career benefits for the individual student consumer, and for meeting a short-sighted conception of the demands of competitiveness in the global economy. The role of the university as a major contributor to culture and to civil society has been undermined by emphasis upon a narrowly utilitarian, individualist, and extrinsic attitude to education. In the midst of this crisis, it has never been more important to be able to articulate a rationale for the study of religion and a defense of the values of a humanistic education. In the last 20 years, a growing body of academic literature has called into question the category of religion from a variety of standpoints. This category, of course, has provided a main point of unity and orientation for the academic field that we work in. What then is the future for a comparative study of religion when the very term itself is being called into question? However one positions oneself in the field, I would like to suggest that there is a need to think beyond the highly policed Cold War between theology and the social, scientific, or secular study of religion that has dominated much of our field in the 20th century. This opposition is built on a binary opposition of the secular and the religious that is itself a constitutive feature of dominant Western discourses of modernity. It is therefore far from an ideologically neutral account of the world. It also, however, does not constitute the only way to imagine either the history or the future of our field. Most mainstream textbook accounts frame the emergence of the comparative study of religion as an ideological battle to establish a science of religion free from Christian theological bias. This explains, for instance, why figures such as Max Muller and William James have been so crucial to mainstream historiographies of religious studies, since both figures grounded their authority claims on the attempt to develop a justifiably scientific approach to the comparative study of religion. However, all of the key thinkers in this history, Muller, James, Durkheim, Weber, Eliade, etc., also participated in another important intellectual legacy, namely the role of the comparative study of religion as a form of cross-cultural and civilizational debate about modernity. As Hans Kippenberg and Walter Hanegraaff have argued separately, the emergence of the history of religions as an academic field has been bound up with debates about the processes of modernization, industrialization, and diverse attempts by scholars to theorize modernity. Much of the classic scholarship in this field was concerned not just with defining a legitimate science of religions, but also with defending and contesting different models of what it is to be modern through a comparative analysis of the other, whether that other is conceived as the Orient, the archaic, or the primitive, or the non-Western. In my opinion, this is a much more interesting way of framing the legacy of the comparative study of religion than the highly policed boundary between secular and religious perspectives. Rather than undermining comparative work, interrogating what one might call the religionization of non-Western cultures highlights the ongoing significance of comparison. Max Muller's famous axiom, which he got from Goethe, of the comparativist method, "He who knows one knows none," I would argue, is even more appropriate if we see ourselves as participants in a scholarly tradition that is engaged in the cultural critique of modernities. Scholars of religion have a crucial role to play within the academy, precisely because of its prevailing secularist assumptions and because one cannot develop sufficient critical distance from dominant discourses of modernity without recourse to pre-modern and non-Western contexts as sites of epistemological difference. That is, without consideration of instances of variation from those dominant discourses. This, by the way, is one reason why cultural and critical theory badly needs to take a cross-cultural or comparativist turn in order to reinvigorate itself in an age of globalization. It's time to widen out what counts as theory and the cultural and civilizational sites from which theory can be generated. The colonial translation of diverse civilizations and traditions through the prism of the category of religion remains, in a Western context at least, the primary point of orientation and intervention for the comparative study of cultures. Religion, I would argue, is the primary place where the foreign suspects are held for interrogation. That there are considerable problems in reading universal history in terms of a deeply embedded category of religion in the modern Western imagination is precisely a reason for its ongoing interrogation by scholars with specialist knowledge of non-Western cultures. In continuing the intellectual legacy of interrogating, debating, and challenging dominant models of modernity and Western identity, there is an important and ongoing role for the comparative study of religion in a post-colonial context, acting, I would argue, as a kind of foreign body or point of infiltration within the Western and largely secularized academy as a whole, a space where both the specialized and comparative study of cultures can take place, a place for the articulation of civilizational differences and the exercise of sensitive comparisons, a site where the Eurocentric, theological, and secularist presuppositions of the academy can be interrogated, explored, and debated. When engaging in comparative cultural critique, what better place to start than with the category of religion itself? Thank you.
Our last speaker is Professor Donald Lopez, Jr., who is the Arthur E. Link Distinguished University Professor of Buddhist and Tibetan Studies at the University of Michigan, where he serves as chair of the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures and as chair of the Michigan Society of Fellows. Professor Lopez received his BA, MA, and PhD from the University of Virginia and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2000. He is currently serving as the editor of the Buddhism portion of the forthcoming Northern Anthology of World Religions. His most recent book is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a biography. His next book, A Short History of the Buddha, examines the history of the European encounter with the Buddha, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. Please welcome Professor Lopez.
Thank you, President Kwok. It's a great honor to be invited to participate today. When graduate students have asked me for advice about how to give their first AAR paper, I've reminded them that they only have 20 minutes and that the members tend to attend 10 or 12 talks a day. And thus, if the audience is left with one idea at the end of the talk, one has done well. I have 15 minutes, so I'll be looking to give you 3/4 of an idea this morning. So, the first book that I downloaded onto my iPhone was Moby Dick. So when I envision the study of religion in the 21st century, I do so in a very literal way, looking at a 19th century text on a 21st century handheld device. I first read Moby Dick, by which I mean the book and not the classic illustrated comic, long after I should have, in 1983, after seeing the Woody Allen film Zelig. In the film, Leonard Zelig explains to a psychiatrist that he became the human chameleon, taking on the characteristics and the characters of whomever he was with, when someone asked him whether he'd ever read Moby Dick, and he said yes. I read it back then in a bound book. I read it last year on a screen, 2,336 screens filled with wonder, a work to be read and pondered each year, a work not translated from a foreign tongue in a foreign land, in a forgotten age, like so many of the work that is my task to read, but a work written in English, in America, not so long ago, and yet it is a sacred text. Chapter 779, entitled The Prairie, is one of the cetiological chapters of Moby Dick. Here, Melville, in the voice of unlettered Ishmael, describes the head of a sperm whale, and I quote, "To scan the lines of his face or feel the bumps on the head of this Leviathan, this is a thing which no physiognomist or phrenologist has as yet undertaken. Such an enterprise would seem almost as hopeful as for Lavatar to have scrutinized the wrinkles on the rock of Gibraltar, or for Gaul to have mounted a ladder and manipulated the dome of the Pantheon. Still, in that famous work of his, Lavater not only treats of the various faces of men, but also attentively studies the faces of horses, birds, serpents, and fish, and dwells in detail upon the modifications of expression discernible therein. Nor have Gall and his disciple Spurzheim failed to throw out some hints touching the phrenological characteristics of other beings than man. Therefore, though I am but still ill-qualified for a pioneer in the application of these two semi-sciences to the whale, I will do my endeavor. I try all things. I achieve what I can." The geographical and archaeological references in this passage remain familiar, but the science does not. For Ishmael, the term physiognomy does not refer simply to the general appearance of an object or an organism, as the term is used in biology today, but rather to its more literal meaning of judging nature, specifically through the study of a person's face. This ancient science, said to have been championed by Aristotle and Pythagoras, was revived by the Swiss poet and pastor Johann Gaspar Lavater in his treatise Physiognomical Fragments for the Promotion of the Knowledge and Love of Man, published in 4 volumes between 1775 and 1778. It enjoyed great influence in Europe. Gall is Franz Joseph Gall, the German physician who developed what came to be known as the science of phrenology. Spurzheim was his famous disciple, the German physician Johann Gaspar Spurzheim. In 1809, Dr. Gall published in German The Anatomy and Physiology of the Nervous System in General and the Brain in Particular, with observations upon the possibility of ascertaining the several intellectual and moral dispositions of man and animal by the configuration of their heads. There he argued presciently that the brain is the seat of the mind. He also argued that various elements of human character, both good and evil, are localized in specific areas of the brain. He enumerated 27 such faculties, including the impulse to reproduce, love for one's children, self-defense, murder, cunning, memory of words, metaphysical capacity, poetic talent, and religious sentiment. He argued that the shape of the brain was determined by the relative size and hence strength of these various functions. And he argued, and this is what he was most famous for, that the shape of the brain determines the shape of the skull, such that the various elevations and depressions on the surface of the cranium can be read by a skilled physician to determine a person's character and intelligence. Phrenology became very popular in Europe, especially in Britain, in the first half of the 19th century, despite scathing criticism as early as 1815 in the Edinburgh Review. Today, it is considered a classic example of a pseudoscience. Indeed, Karl Popper identified phrenology along with astrology as a pseudoscience when setting forth his notion that falsifiability is what separates science from pseudoscience. On August 26, 1873, 21 years after the publication of Moby Dick, a great debate took place between Christianity and Buddhism, between a Methodist minister and a Buddhist monk in the town of Panadure in Sri Lanka. Each of the parties in the debate would claim that his religion was compatible with science, although what they meant by science seemed to differ. For the Buddhist, science often seemed to mean astrology. He noted that the great astrologers, those who were able to predict the date of a man's death, always invoked the Buddha. For the Christian, science meant astronomy, geography, and technology, that is, what was considered the best science of the day. Samuel Langdon, a Wesleyan minister from Britain who reported on the debate in the quarterly letters addressed to the general secretaries of the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society, looked out that day on the sea of shaven heads of Buddhist monks in the audience and wrote, and I quote, "The sight of so many heads, some very fine ones, so closely shaved, would have been a rare treat for us if we'd been disciples of Gall and Spurzheim." In fairness to Samuel Langdon, it is quite possible that his comment about the sea of Buddhist craniums at Panadure was made in jest. But there is also something cautionary about his remark. It is that the science of yesterday can become the folly of today, and that this phenomenon may occur even in the realm of religion, where we have traditionally had a very high tolerance for folly. This occurs to me as I contemplate the claims for the compatibility of Buddhism and science in the 21st century. This claim has a long history, going back over a century and a half, during which it has passed through several incarnations, with Buddhism said to be compatible with Newtonian physics, with the theory of evolution, with quantum mechanics, and with the Big Bang theory. This claim has been reborn most recently in the form of what might be called mindfulness mania. One need only go to the Google Ngram viewer and chart the occurrence of the term mindfulness in English language publications between 1800 and 2010. On a recent visit to the University of Michigan Medical Center, I noticed a flyer on a bulletin board for a meditation class which promised to, quote, "manage stress, quiet habitual thoughts, boost disease resistance, maintain overall health, manage high blood pressure, sleep disorders, lifestyle changes, physical and emotional pain." Precisely the kinds of things one might find listed on the label of any number of 19th century elixirs. The meditation practice that is being taught in various medical centers today is called mindfulness, a term that is often identified as Buddhist and even as the heart of Buddhist meditation. Its origins can be traced through a rather circuitous route, not back to the Buddha in India in the 5th century BCE, but back to a Buddhist monk in Burma in the late 19th century who saw the presence of the British in his homeland as a portent of the apocalypse. In order to save the Dharma, he proposed a radical solution, one previously unknown in the history of Buddhism: teach lay people how to meditate. Thus, just like everything else, it seems, mindfulness was invented in the 19th century, yet another of the strange effects of colonialism. If someone practices mindfulness and is able to manage stress and quiet habitual thoughts, that would be a good thing, as we say. At present, it appears that neuroscience is at an early stage of research to determine whether or not mindfulness works in any clinically measurable way. The more important question for the student of religion is what we might call the psychology, the sociology, and the history of such claims, asking, for example, why is it that this particular form of self-help gains a certain validation by the addition of the adjective Buddhist, and why the claim for the compatibility of Buddhism and science have persisted for so long, despite radical changes in what is meant by the term Buddhism, what is meant by the term science over the past 150 years. These are questions that the student of religion in the 21st century might ponder. Such a student has responsibilities. In this case, those responsibilities would be to note that the term mindfulness does not encompass all forms of Buddhist meditation, and that in both the popular and medical media, its importance within the huge domain of Buddhist meditation has been largely misconstrued. It would be to note that far from serving to reduce stress, many of the most common and important forms of Buddhist meditation are intended to induce stress. One thinks immediately of the meditation on the fact that death is certain, but the time of death is uncertain, and meditation on the foulness of the human body. It would be to note that many of the most common and important forms of Buddhist meditation are intended not to quiet habitual thoughts, but to produce them. Habitual thoughts such as that all existence is scarred by impermanence, suffering, and no self, the habitual thought that I vow to achieve Buddhahood in order to liberate all beings in the universe from suffering, the habitual thought, does a dog have the Buddha nature? Buddhism has no church to rule on the proper interpretation of its doctrines. It has no academy to regulate the use of its language, nor is it the job of the scholar to assume such roles. Furthermore, the study of religion does not have a falsifiability principle that can be employed to distinguish truth from falsehood, although the various religions make their own claims in this regard. All we really have is history. Making use of the marvelous technologies available to us, which provide access to all manner of old documents without needing to stir from our desk, we're able to trace when the claims for the compatibility of Buddhism and science were made, and by whom, who repeated what, and where. And so, for example, we're able to trace the coinage of the term mindfulness to render the Sanskrit term smriti and the Pali term sati to 1881, and the Victorian scholar and erstwhile colonial official Thomas W. Rhys-Davids in a volume entitled Buddhist Suttas in Max Muller's Sacred Books of the East series. And going back further in the history of Buddhism, it is possible to say with some certainty that whatever people think meditation means in Buddhism now, it has meant something very different, indeed many very different things in the past. The task of the scholar is not to represent a religious tradition in any legal sense. But in another sense, the scholar is charged with the representation of the tradition as fully and accurately as possible in all of its messy detail. And having done so, the scholar might also politely point out the discrepancies that exist between the long past and the fleeting present. On the question of Buddhism and science, I have been, like Ishmael, wandering alone in the wilderness, unheeded by all. The enthusiasts remain unconvinced that there could be a problem with describing deep mathematical insights to an Iron Age Indian mendicant. My fellow scholars of Buddhism are uninterested. For them, the claims of the compatibility are so obviously nonsense that they wonder why I'm wasting my time. Therefore, inspired by recent events, I've decided to turn to social media to start a new movement, but first I need to find a name for the cause. At the moment, I'm unable to decide between two possibilities. The first is the anti-mindfulness movement. The second is the mindless movement. Your suggestions are welcome. Thank you.
I want to thank the panelists once again, and I want to thank you all for coming to this plenary.